synthesizers, but you know, this is not unusual to see because each one has its own place and does its own thing. So where an interesting starting point might be is just to think about the synthesizers that we have here before we perhaps go into a bit more of a technical deep dive into the TO5. So, well, I will start with the TO5 before we go into the technical side, just to explain a little bit about it. And hopefully you can see it all on the screen here, and hopefully when you see me start to play around with the controls, you'll get a good idea of what I'm doing. But if you look at this instrument here, and the size and the format, the case that it's sitting in, and then if you take a look up to the top of the tower here, you'll see there's a lot of similarities there in terms of the formats. And it's very true that the TO5 from the Oberheim house, let's say, follows a lot of similarities to the Take 5, which is very much the sequential side of things. Now, it's also true to say that these two products are, and I said this earlier, I don't like the word cheapest. That has a negative idea, I think. The least expensive. These two products are really the least expensive in the sequential and Oberheim range. I'm not sure in Lira how much these sort of prices are. Amit is your man for prices later on if you want to chat to him about those. But these represent almost the kind of, let's say, the entry point into the world of sequential and Oberheim. But in actual fact, these synthesizers are also very powerful devices with a lot of capabilities. I would say that the TO5 here is the least expensive Oberheim synthesizer that you can buy today, and is the most powerful Oberheim synthesizer you can buy today, which might sound a bit kind of crazy, a little bit strange, when we're sitting next to an Oberheim OB-X8 here, which is, well, I mean, in euros, we're looking at, for the keyboard version of this, around about 5,000 euros, the most expensive thing we sell at Focusrite. But there are differences. So I mentioned about this being the least expensive to buy today, and that being the most expensive that we can buy today. But if you were to buy an Oberheim from 1980, an OBX, you would be paying 3 times, if not a little bit more than the price of this one, to have one of those old vintage systems. You know, it's not unusual to see an OBX or an OB8, not an OBX8, but an OBX or an OB8 for nearly 20,000 euros. And that, I think, is quite interesting as well. There's something very special about the Oberheim sound that people want. These synthesizers were used in many, many hit records throughout the 80s and 90s, I guess, as well. But they're quite different. The Oberheim here, the OBX8, is 8 voices. It can play 8 notes at the same time. It's polyphonic. We have monophonic synths that can play 1 note, and polyphonic synths that can play many notes. This can play up to 8 voices at one time. This is a combination of synthesizers that came from Oberheim from 1979 through to about 1985. The OB8, the OBX, and the OBXA synthesizers. These have been, with great detail, remade in this format, including, for example, on the patches that we have here. I'll go to the OB8 patch, and now I have original patches from the original synthesizers here. This is the OB8, and when you hear them, they're really very basic patches, you know. This one's called Whistle, and such a simple, basic patch. But this is the sort of patch that you would find on the original. And yeah, that's not one of our patches. and yeah, and what we've done with this one is to take all of those old synthesizers and rebuild them to exact standards to put them in here. Also, we've worked with a guy called Marcus Ryle. Now, Tom Oberheim, in the very late 70s, found this guy, Marcus Ryle, and started working with him. And Marcus was responsible for pretty much the project management of the synthesizers that we find in here. Marcus is with Oberheim again today. Marcus Ryle is a very interesting guy. I mentioned earlier when we were doing some training today, he's the guy who started a company called Line 6, if you're familiar with guitar effects. He's also, and Amit likes this one, the inventor of the ADAT protocol, digital light pipe connections. So a very, very clever guy. But when he was a young man, he was working with Tom Oberheim, and he essentially led the projects for those polyphonic synths from the 1980s, early 1980s. He came back here, and with his ears and his understanding of the originals, they have been so exactly represented in here. So even though this is €5,000 for this synthesizer, actually what you have is 4 synthesizers in this one box, with that exact sound that has been developed. And if you consider that an OB8 or an OBX, as I say, is about maybe 15 to 17,000 euros, and you have 3 of those kind of original sounds in here, but in a modern box that has a warranty, it actually becomes a slightly better value idea. So that's the OBX8. I mean, this is a really powerful, well, no, I'm not going to use that word. This is an amazing sounding instrument. It's exactly right. It sounds perfect. I say I'm not going to use the word powerful because this is still using the same kind of technologies and controls that you would find on a synthesizer in 1980. 1980 was 45 years ago. We've come a long, long way since that time. And actually, if you look at the top panel here and the type of control you have, this is actually quite basic now, you know. This is not what we come to expect from a modern synthesizer. You know, I guess we're all fairly familiar with VSTs and software plugins. And you can probably get an OB8 or an OBX as a software plugin. But you can also get things like Serum and Arturia's Pigments, which are insanely powerful instruments, insanely powerful. Pigments itself, there's nothing quite like it, I don't think, in terms of synthesizers. What Pigments isn't, though, is a hardware synthesizer. It's a thing that you move around with a mouse. And for me personally, I like instruments. I like to play instruments and be able to hold and find the sounds, massage them and play with them. But yeah, in real terms, this has a basic architecture. It is not a particularly powerful in terms of modulation synthesizer. What this is, though, is exactly the right sound. And if you want that Oberheim sound, this is a way to get it. Now, I guess, what is an Oberheim sound? Well, in 1974, which was the year I was born, Tom Oberheim made his first synthesizer. He started his company, Tom Oberheim, in 1969, and his very first project was an effects processor called a ring modulator, a ring mod. You find ring mods on synths, you find them as effects in Ableton, in Cubase, in Logic, all of those things. Tom Oberheim was one of the very first people to make a ring modulator as a commercial product. He was just experimenting and made this weird box, and people heard about this weird box and asked to buy it from him, so he started to produce them. Tom Oberheim, who by the way is still around today and is, you know, but yeah, TO5, Thomas Elroy Oberheim, that's where the name comes from. He's still around today. He, you know, he's been involved with the production of the TO5. He didn't engineer or design this one, but he's been involved from the start. Yeah, he's 89 now. You know, he's been around for a long, long time. He's a bit of a legend in the synthesizer world. Yeah, so Tom. Yeah, so that's it. What is an Oberheim synthesizer? Well, the first synth he made in 1979 is called the SEM, S-E-M. It's called the Synthesizer Expander Module. It was a small box. You can look this up and find it. There are still a few of them around in the world today. And it was a box to accompany a product that he made before, which was a sequencer. He'd made a sequencer to be able to control and play notes, a sequence of notes, a sequence of data. But what he didn't have was a voice or a sound to control. So the SEM was a synthesizer that he built to go alongside his sequencer. Now the SEM has become a legendary synth. It's a mono synth. It only has one note, but cleverly he put them together to make a 2-voice and a 4-voice, which became really the first polyphonic synthesizers. But the thing about the SEM is it had a very particular filter. Now, I mentioned at the beginning we have all of these different analog synthesizers that all have their own personality and their place and their sound. And one of the big reasons for that is the synthesizer's filter. The filter on a synthesizer, for me, is where the personality and the character lives. And why is that? Well, we have different types of filters that behave different in different ways. And the SEM filter is a very particular type of filter that has its own particular type of sound. The SEM filter was generated in 1974 and is a specific type. Let's see if I can give you an example of that. Here we go. This is a patch. I mean, I always use this to demonstrate the SEM filter. This is a patch from a famous song from a band called Rush in the 1980s. The song's called Tom Sawyer. And if you just listen to this, you kind of get an idea. I'm going to turn it up, so be careful. I'm going to turn it up for this, but you can hear the way that filter's sounding. It's a big sound. And you can hear the filter sweep down as well. Now, of course, that's the modulation. We'll talk about how all these things interconnect. But that sound, that sweeping down sound, is really interesting. Now I'm going to go to the initial patch here. And the initial patch is where I always start. You'll get bored of this sound throughout the presentation. I do apologise, but we're going to go there a lot. And here is my basic patch. This is just a single oscillator, sound generating oscillator, making a sawtooth wave shape, a very harmonic, rich, bright sound. This is the low pass filter. So. Okay, now that's quite boring really, there's not much going on. And there are a lot of low pass filters around, and we'll explore some other low pass filters over there as well. But what's really interesting with this one is, it doesn't self-oscillate. Now what does that mean? Well, I have my oscillators making sound, they're the generators of the sound. It's a waveform that's moving very, very fast enough for us as humans to hear this as a pitch. And with analog filters, we have a resonance control. The resonance, if turned up to a full level, will make the filter also oscillate. And it will produce a pure sine wave. I can demonstrate it on this one actually. So here we go, basic problem. There's the sawtooth again. Now I'll turn off the sawtooth, turn off all the oscillators in the mixer here. And if I turn the resonance up, this is where it gets a little bit scary, so. That is just the filter. And I've actually got aftertouch on it, so I can play the pitch with it. You can hear I'm playing lots of different notes and it's the same pitch, because the filter at this point is not tracking the keyboard. But you can hear. And if I bring in the oscillator again, you can tune those. Anyway, that is a self-oscillating filter. This one, if I take the oscillators off, turn the resonance all the way up, just hear a little bit of background noise. That's just the noise floor going through the filter. There's no real sound there. There's no sine wave being produced in that way. This is not self-oscillating, okay? So that means it's also got a different type of personality to that filter immediately. But then if I bring in the oscillators, And so we heard the low pass before, just remind us. Pretty basic sound. But then if I bring in the resonance is an emphasis, a peak at the point of where the filter is filtering out frequencies. So sometimes you see it as resonance, sometimes you see it as emphasis. Sometimes you can see it as Q as well, the letter Q. But let's just put the resonance up a bit. This is halfway now. That's already got a nicer or sort of more appropriate sound than halfway again. And then if we put it on full, we know it will not self-oscillate, so we don't have to worry, not that I ever worry about self-oscillating filters, but it won't create a sine wave. It will still not quite self-oscillate, but now when we listen to it, it's got a lot of sound, a lot of personality in that sound. And of course, this is polyphonic. So if I play a couple of notes, maybe I'll just hold on 3 notes. And now, one note. Just have the one filter. And then if we hold on several notes, so we can use this filter to get very different kinds of sounds than we could potentially from a filter like this. But there's another interesting thing with the TO5. So, this is a low pass filter. As I use the cutoff, I let the low frequencies pass through. It's a low pass filter. But it's also what we call a state variable filter. I can also change the behavior of this filter from being low pass through different stages. So this is low pass. If I move this knob now into the middle, this is called a notch filter. So a low pass filter will let the low sounds pass through and get rid of the high sounds. A notch filter will do this, so it lets the middle sounds through and gets rid of the high and low. So let's listen to that. Subtle, this filter. Again, if I put the resonance on full, so already it has a very different kind of behavior from a low pass filter that we might find, for example, on the Take 5 synth. Now we've got low pass, we've got notch, and if I move all the way to this side, we now have a high pass filter. And this is basically a low pass filter, but opposite. It lets the high frequencies, the high energy, still pass through. So we just have high sounds. So this is a state variable filter, low pass, notch, and high pass. And on the Take 5, which again is in the same case, this is simply a low pass filter. But this is self-oscillating. This is 24 dB per octave. That's a technical term for it's a lot more of an aggressive slope for the filter. This is 12 dB per octave. So again, you can see very similar looking devices, but already we're finding some big differences between how they kind of operate and how we can use them. Now, we have low pass, notch and high pass here, but also if I go to my program menu, I can then switch in what's called a band pass filter. I can find it, remember where it is. Filter, it's in the menu here. I know it's here somewhere, but it's not there. All right, go on. Here we go, band pass. When I turn that on now, you might see I've got a little red light here. I turn it off, here, on. Now it means this center position is a band pass. If you remember the notch filter, we notched out the middle section, and the band pass is the opposite. We notch out the high and the low, and we're left with a bell shape in the middle. And this